Chloe Peterson put this out about 20 minutes ago. Now, this one little part right here, it says Stephanie White on Aaliyah Boston and Caitlin Clark subbed out at the 6:30 mark of the first quarter, after which Portland went on a 13-2 run. This was the moment right here when this game got out of hand. In that first quarter, when they went on that 13-2 run, the Fever could not catch up. The gas was gone. The tires was...
There's a moment in sports, a single quiet moment where everything changes. Not a buzzer beater. Not a spectacular dunk. A substitution. A coach walking to the scorer's table holding up 2 fingers and pulling 2 players off the floor. 6 minutes and 30 seconds into the first quarter. That's when it happened. And what followed in the next 4 minutes wasn't just a basketball game falling apart, it was an organization's deepest dysfunction revealing itself in real time, live in front of everyone, and somehow almost nobody is talking about the right part of it. Because here's what most people got wrong this weekend: the substitution wasn't the scandal. What came after it was. Saturday's game against the Portland Fire started the way Indiana Fever fans have been begging for all season. Push pace, move the ball, attack early. 8-2. The lead was real. The momentum wasn't just noticeable, it was measurable. Portland, the same expansion franchise that embarrassed this team by 16 points in their last meeting, looked genuinely disorganized. They looked like a team that had not prepared for what Indiana was bringing to them in this specific game. And in that moment, something rare was happening: a Fever team that actually looked like the version of itself that the talent on that roster is capable of producing. Then Stephanie White stood up. She walked to the table. She pulled Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston off the floor at the exact same time. And what happened next unfolded so fast and so completely that the film record of it almost feels surreal to watch. Portland went on a 13-2 run. The lead didn't just disappear, it reversed. The momentum, the defensive posture, the offensive rhythm, the arena's energy, all of it flipped inside of 4 minutes. And it never came back. Final score 84-100, Portland Fire. Now here is where most of the conversation this weekend stopped. People clipped the run. They posted the score. They argued about the substitution in the abstract. But the substitution, as analytically significant as it is actually the second most important thing that happened on Saturday. The most important thing happened in the room after the game. Because what Stephanie White said in that press conference, on the record in her own words, fully documented, is not just an explanation. It is a confession. And once you understand what she actually admitted to, you cannot watch this team the same way again. Reporter Chloe Peterson asked the question directly. She laid out the facts cleanly, professionally, without editorializing. The Fever started 8-2. Clark and Boston came off at 6:30 in the first quarter. Portland went on a 13-2 run. What was the reasoning? White's answer had 2 parts. The first part was medically grounded. Aaliyah Boston is on a minutes restriction. That's a legitimate rationale. Medical staff input shapes those decisions, and a press conference is not the venue to fully interrogate that dimension of player management. Fine. Accepted. Moving on. But the second part of her answer, the part about Caitlin Clark, is where the tape stops and refuses to move forward without examination. White said on the record, typically, that is around the same time that we have been taking Caitlin out. Read that sentence again slowly. Typically, around the same time that we have been taking Caitlin out. She did not say Clark was showing fatigue. She did not say there was a matchup concern, a foul situation developing, a strategic reason to create a specific lineup configuration. She said, "This is when we usually do it." The Fever were leading by 6 points. Clark was a functional, producing component of the offensive sequence that built that lead. The game's momentum was measurably in Indiana's favor. And the decision to remove the most important player on the floor was not made by reading the game. It was made by reading a clock. That is the distinction that matters. That is the thing that the score alone cannot tell you, but the press conference does. In professional basketball, there is a foundational principle that separates elite coaches from competent ones. The live game is always the primary input. The pregame plan is always secondary. You walk into every game with a rotation framework. You have to. Load management, foul anticipation, matchup preparation. Minutes distribution across a roster, these are legitimate organizational tools. But they're tools. They are not scripts. The moment a live game produces conditions that override the pre-game plan momentum in your favor, your best players producing, your opponent disrupted, the framework exists to be overridden by that information. Every coach who has won at the highest level understands this instinctively. The temporary variance from the rotation plan costs you nothing compared to what maintaining that competitive edge is worth. What White's press conference statement documents, in her own language, is that the override did not happen. Because the override was not in the decision-making framework at all. The rotation was typical. The timing was pre-established. The game state was not the primary input. And here is why that single realization is so much more alarming than one bad substitution. In one game, it is not a mistake. A mistake is a misread. A mistake is acting on bad information in a high-pressure moment. What White described is not a mistake. It is a philosophy. And a philosophy reproduces itself. Every game where the preset rotation clock conflicts with what the live competitive situation is demanding, this will happen again. Not because of a bad moment, because of a documented approach to how rotation decisions get made. The accountability dimension of Saturday's press conference is the part that the most analytically rigorous observers have identified as the most organizationally significant, and they are right. Listen to the language pattern White consistently deployed across every question she was asked. We are looking at our rotations. This is our typical substitution pattern. We are working through these things as a staff. Collective pronouns, distributed ownership, diffused accountability across a group entity. Every time the question was pointing directly at a decision that belongs to one individual. The head coach holds the clipboard. The head coach makes the substitution call. When that call produces a 13-2 run that reverses the game and functionally determines the outcome, the accountability for it is not a staff meeting's shared responsibility. It belongs to the person who made it. And there is something deeply revealing about a leadership figure who, when faced with documented evidence that a specific decision produced a specific bad outcome, reaches instinctively for collective language to distribute the weight of it. That is not humility. Humility would sound like, I made that call, the game was telling me something different, and I didn't adjust. That is the sentence that builds trust. That is the sentence that tells a locker room and a fan base and a front office that the person holding the clipboard can see the gap between what they planned and what the game required. What White gave instead was typically, that is around the same time that we have been taking Caitlin out. Which is not an explanation. It is an illustration of exactly the problem. Now let's talk about the third quarter, because 37 points allowed in a single quarter requires its own level of direct examination, and the explanation White offered for it is where the organizational accountability concern escalates from significant to serious. Slow rotations. Foul trouble. Insufficient defensive anticipation. Those were the characterizations. And they may be partially accurate as descriptions of what the camera captured: players arriving late to coverage assignments, defenders in foul trouble pulling out of contests, gaps in the defensive shell that Portland found and exploited repeatedly. But notice what that explanation does and does not do. It describes what players failed to execute. It does not examine what the defensive scheme design required them to execute in the first place. Portland scored 37 points in a quarter because they found specific coverage gaps in the structure Indiana deployed. Those gaps were not random. They were produced by personnel matchup decisions and scheme design, both of which are coaching staff responsibilities. The players who were rotating slowly were rotating to cover for structural vulnerabilities that a different scheme design would not have placed them in. The players who were in foul trouble partly because the defensive assignments they were given put them in positions where physical contest was the only available recovery option when the scheme's first line of protection failed. Explaining 37 points by saying players didn't rotate fast enough is like explaining a flood by saying the floor got wet. It is technically accurate. It is analytically useless. And it protects the scheme design that produced the structural vulnerability from any examination at all. The offensive breakdown runs parallel. The Fever opened 0 for 9 from three-point range before Sophie Cunningham finally connected late in the second quarter. White's explanation focused on pass timing, balls arriving late, requiring shooters to reach or reset rather than catching in rhythm for immediate shot opportunities. That description is accurate for the symptom. But in professional basketball, late passes don't come from passers who need to be told to pass earlier. Late passes come from delivery angles that are contested or disrupted, from defensive positioning that has already taken away the primary window and forced the passer into a secondary read that arrives one timing beat after the shooter's optimal release moment.